but we're happy to be back. And so we traveled. For me, it's been 4.5 years since I last crossed the Atlantic. I've actually never left from here to go back to Europe, only from Bermuda, when we were still in Bermuda 4.5 years ago. And so it was high time to go back. I hadn't seen my parents in 7 years. I hadn't been in Germany for that long. And that's where I was born. So that answers that question. What's his accent? So it's German. That's for our visiting friends and for those members that have forgotten already. And there are 3 lessons that I learned on our trip. Well, it's probably more than 3, but we'll limit it to 3. Good sermons have 3 points, and so we'll have 3 lessons. The first lesson was I learned right at the beginning. We left New Jersey, and it was a nice day like today. It was warm, it was summer. What we define here as summer. It was 85, almost 90 degrees. It was beautiful, it was lovely. So when we arrived in England, that wasn't the case. In England, it was in the mid-60s. And while the humidity here was sort of 65, 70%, and it was barely felt sometimes, the humidity in England was of a more precipitous nature. Sorry. So in England it rained. And it was grey. And as we left the airport in the south of London and had to go to Barbara's family who lives on the other side of London, we were met by this. Okay, by a very dark slide that shows cars on a motorway that didn't move very fast. Aha. And so I learned a lesson right there that things don't always... Somebody lower these, please. Because I don't want to tear it down in the middle of the sermon and then have to kind of try and make a sermonic point of how I destroy the inventory of the church. Because that would take us away from the vacation lessons that I've tried to tell us here this morning. See, now the gray comes out much better. So it was rainy and it was traffic. And it taught me my first lesson, and this is the first one I'm going to spin on a little bit, and that is that things don't always go as we plan. Things don't always go as we plan. Sometimes there's rain, sometimes there's traffic, sometimes there are hold-ups in our lives. So from London, the next day we traveled to Berlin, the German capital. This is the Reichstag. This is the building this is the place where the German government meets. This is sort of the Capitol building equivalent in Germany. This is where all the elected representatives meet and thrash out whatever they do there. And just like the Capitol building in DC, the Reichstag in Berlin also has a dome. Right, there. Now, the original dome was destroyed, was damaged during the war and then was taken down after the war. And after the unification 25 years ago, it was thought that we have to renovate this building since the German government would move its seat back to where it was before the war, and that was Berlin. And so a British architect, Sir Norman Foster, was asked to design a dome for the Reichstag. And I mentioned this dome because you can actually visit this thing. You can go in there and you can go up and you can walk around in this dome. It's really beautiful. But in order to go in, you can't just walk in. It says, "Hi, I'm Stefan, I live in New Jersey now, I want to see the dome." No, you have to go and get a ticket. You have to get a ticket. Now the ticket is free. Yay. Which is nice. But to get the ticket, you have to line up. And so I did. I thought, well, I better get there early because there were plenty of tourists there this summer. So I got up early in the morning and I took the subway to the place where they hand out those tickets for the day. And I stood in line and, because I got there early, the line wasn't too bad. And then a lady came out of the ticket office and said, well, make sure you have your passports. And the passports of every party, every member in your party that you want to get tickets for. Right. I had left my sleeping family in the place where we stayed because although my wife doesn't believe in jet lag, they were jet lagged, and so they slept long. And I sacrificed my sleep and went to get those tickets, but I needed a passport for all of them, all three of them. All four of us needed passports. So I left my place in the queue, in the line, and I went back to where we stayed. I grabbed the passports. I took the subway back to the Reichstag, to the ticket office. And when I arrived, the place where I had been before in the queue, well, wasn't there anymore. Because the hour that it took for me to go and get the passports and come back, other tourists had used to populate this line to the degree that where I was now standing was somewhat less encouraging. Things don't always go as we plan, and so I was informed that it probably takes 2 hours from where I was standing, because there was of course a computer glitch on that particular day that I wanted to get a ticket, and it would take about 2 hours. And I thought, well, you don't come to Berlin all the time, very often, might as well wait it out. So I was getting ready for my 2-hour wait in the sun, in the morning, standing around in Berlin. Things don't always go as we plan. Sometimes things go slower than we plan, and they go slower, not sometimes so that not because there's a purpose behind it, but just because the circumstances happen that way. But here's something that we can do when these things happen. We can learn and exercise and teach ourselves patience. How many times in our lives do things go not quite according to plan, or they don't go as quickly as we want them to, and we are all getting frazzled and nervous and, you know what I mean? But to then force yourself to calm down, pray, God will give you strength, and to learn patience. Vacation lesson number 1 was that things don't go always according to plan. Sometimes they take longer than we wish, and that teaches us patience. Eventually I got my ticket, and we got into the dome. Aha. Is it? Interesting. That's the dome close up with a well-known person in front. And you can walk up in there. There's a spiral walkway all the way up. You have your devices, and it tells you that if you look over there, that building, that happened at that time. And then you walk a little further, and it's a 360-degree view. Over there, at that particular time, that happened. And this building here is so-and-so. And if you look there, it reminds me of a little plaque that I saw once here in America. In 1857, on this place, nothing happened. But that didn't happen in Berlin. And so we made it all the way to the top, and we had a good time. When things don't always go as we planned them, sometimes they go slower, and we can learn patience. I'll leave that one out. That was that was a piece of the Berlin Wall. The wall, of course, fell on the 9th of November 1989, and there are still pieces of it. This is a genuine, original piece with plenty of non-genuine bubble gum. I have no idea why they did that. Tourists do strange things. They put locks on bridges, bubble gum on wall segments. No idea. I'm going to talk about this another time, the lesson behind this piece of wall. But going on to London. So after Berlin, we were in London, and I hadn't been in London for a long time. The day I wanted to go into London, because my sister-in-law lives a bit outside, I caught a train and I drove into London, and I had planned to see all the sights, and I planned to go and see other places and to look for something and, some shopping and stuff. And what connects London really to get you quickly from one place to another, and if you've ever been to New York, you know that it's not the cabs. Well, they are too, but they are very expensive. No, you go on the subway. It took me almost 5 years to get back to London. And the day I came back, I was greeted by this. A subway strike. Instead of crowds of people, there were barriers. I couldn't go anywhere. So instead of taking the train quickly from one place to another, had to now join the millions of other people in the bus. And because that was crowded and wasn't always pleasant, I did what the rest of us did. You walk. Well, and so sometimes when things don't go according to plan, we don't just learn patience. To learn patience is, of course, an exercise in itself, but sometimes there is a lesson in there to make us exercise. To make us not just physically exercise. Sometimes that is necessary. Let me have a look. Right? Euro, we'll bring them all in tomorrow morning, 7:30, in the gym. When we do crazy things with weights, and sometimes physical exercise is necessary. And I'm not saying this for a joke. No, we need to exercise physically because most of us have sedentary jobs where we sit behind a computer screen all day long, or we drive from our house to our jobs where we sit all day, and then we go back into the same car that took us there and drive back home where we then sit around the table or in front of another screen until we then get up and walk the enormous distance from the living room to the bedroom where we will fall asleep. And that is the extent of our physical exercise. Physical exercise is important. So when things don't always go as we plan, there may be a reason behind it, or maybe we can just use these circumstances to learn something. And one of the things, besides patience, is to physically exercise. But not just that, emotionally exercise. To be patient is not something that drops into our mind, it's something that we learn. To not go off at the first sign of trouble and run around like a headless chicken, but to have serenity. These are things that are learned, and sometimes they cannot be self-generated. It means I can't produce this by myself. I have to go to somebody who can give it to me. And that in itself is an exercise, because to take time out every day to go to him who can supply these things to us is an exercise. When you only have 5 minutes and you the exercise is to get up a little earlier, and I'm guilty as charged, just like most of us here. Do we spend as much time with the Lord in the morning as we should? See? Me too. For some of us, it is a particular length of time. For others, it is another length of time. That's why I'm not mentioning any particular number right now. But we all can exercise our faith more by getting maybe up a little earlier, spending more time with him, or spending time with him full stop. When things don't go always as we plan, like it didn't on this particular Thursday when I was there, it made me exercise. It forced me to exercise. And so sometimes situations come into our lives that may force us to do what we could have done before, but now we have to. Don't worry, the next day I was back in London and everything was back to normal. Things don't always go according to plan. And in London I went to the National Gallery to see some famous paintings. This is a Van Gogh. See, I wouldn't have known this either. But I walked into this room, and there it was. It was really beautiful, and much more beautiful in real life than on, the yellows. They're really bright and powerful in reality. So if you ever go to London, go to the National Gallery, which is free, by the way, and have a look at Van Gogh. Problem was, when I was there were other famous paintings I wanted to see. There were, what's his name? Rembrandt. Anybody heard of Rembrandt before? Yeah, famous Dutch painter. So I thought, let me be cultural and let me show off to the churches when I get back to New Jersey. I seen a Rembrandt. So I walked to the room that the Rembrandt was in, and the room was locked because they had a staff shortage, and that room was closed. Things don't always go as we plan, and we can't sometimes get to where we want to go, where we had planned to go, because the doors are locked. And what do we do then? I could have stood in front of this locked door and banged against it. I could have cried my eyes out and gone to an official at the National Gallery and says, please open the door. I flew miles from New Jersey to be here in London to see Rembrandt. Can't you let me in? No, but I didn't do that. Instead, I went back, and after I'd seen Van Gogh, I went to see Monet and his water lily pond. And after I'd seen one Monet, I found another one. And I really like this one. I really like this one because it has the water lilies here floating on a very calm pond, and the reflection in the water is that of a tree on the other side of the lake, and the setting sun, the evening colors here, with a bit of grass in the foreground. So the water lilies almost hover, float in space, but no, they're floating on a very clear, very calm lake. I really like this painting. I hadn't seen this or hadn't appreciated this painting had I gone over to Van Gogh and watched at some people dissecting each other or standing watch or whatever the Rembrandt is in the National Gallery in London. When things don't always go as we plan, don't fret, because who knows? Maybe, just maybe, there's something better in the next room that is open to you than there was in the room that was closed to you. When things don't always go as we plan, every now and then they have a silver lining. Like this painting, to me, was a silver lining. There are 3 examples. That was number 1. This is number 2. 3 quick examples of silver linings. This is a train, obviously. A train that took me from Berlin to the place where I was born. And I hadn't been in a train for, if I was in Germany the last time 7 years ago, then I was the last time on a train, 12, 15 years ago, a long time. So to me, this was a really important thing. And I made sure I reserved myself a good seat in that train, the one that I'm in there. It had a table in front of it. It was by the window, so I could see. So I could just gawk at the North German countryside that I grew up in. I know it's probably boring to most of you, but anyway, that was me being nerdy. So when I got onto the train, I found my seat. It had a little display at the top. It said Berlin to Hildesheim. That was my reservation. And then I realized that the seat in front opposite me, on the other side of the table, had also a little sign. Berlin to Mannheim, which is a lot further than where I was traveling, meaning somebody was going to sit opposite me at that table, where I had hoped to sit with legroom and spread out my stuff, even though I probably won't read any of the books because I was gawking outside looking at the nice landscape. So the next station in Berlin, the lady got on, she sat down, there went my legroom, there went my space, my table space, and now I had somebody sitting opposite me. And maybe I've been in New Jersey too long now, but I wasn't in the mood to make conversation. This was my train ride. I wanted to just like you do on the plane. You put on your big Bose earmuff headphones and isolate yourself from the rest of the world. You're all going to do whatever you want to do in your plane. I'm going to be here in my world until we land. That's what I was wanted to do. But this lady had other plans, and so she started talking. I'm talking about silver linings. When things don't always go as we plan. In the course of the conversation, which was of course very general, so hi, and who are you, how are you, how are you, fine. So I said to her, yeah, I'm traveling, I live in America now, haven't been home for a long time, going back to somewhere I grew up, where I was born. And she said, oh yeah, I'm from a little town not far from here, which we were driving by on the train. And I said, oh, my brother lives there, in that town. And my parents used to live where I was traveling to for 50 years, because that's where I grew up, and then they left there after 50 years, and they moved closer to where my brother lives now. At that time, at that moment in the conversation, the lady looks at me and she says, so what's your name? Olan, some stranger in a train, right? One of 80 million Germans. Asks me who I am. My thought was, what do why do you care? So I said, yeah, my name is Schnüll. And then she says 3 words. Emma, Fiete, and Smilla. Those are the names of my brother's children. Because the lady sitting across from me in a train was the kindergarten teacher of my brother's children. It's a small world in a big country. Berlin is smaller than New York. Yes, it's probably the size of Philadelphia. So what are the chances? And we were like, wow. Sometimes when things don't go according to plan, there may just be a nice surprise in store, a silver lining. So sometimes we can be satisfied with what we have because we see things that we already have access to and appreciate them rather than cry over the things that we can't get to. That's a silver lining. Sometimes it's just a nice surprise out of the blue. Doesn't happen very often. I don't know if this ever happens to me again. But I will cherish it, and I'm going to use this and milk this for sermon illustration until Jesus comes. And the third silver lining, when things don't go as to plan, has to do with this slide. This is the inside of an airplane. These are my feet and legs. And as we can see, around those legs and feet, beyond the limits of my body, is a lot of space. See, I had booked a window seat on my flight home to New Jersey. When we got into the plane, there was a young mother in my seat with her baby that the airline had placed there because they needed a window seat for the baby's chair. She couldn't sit in the middle section where they wanted me to sit now. The middle section, the middle seat of the middle section, the worst seat in any airplane ever devised, which I didn't sit because somebody came and claimed that seat, and I was happy. I was like, please take your seat. I don't want it. And so eventually the airline put me in this seat, which was by the door of this 787 in the front row on the aisle, where the only limit in front of me was the seat of the flight attendant across from me, which was about this distance. I had never had that much leg room in my life before. When things don't always go as we plan, they teach us patience, they make us exercise, and every now and then they have a silver lining. They have a silver lining that teaches Number one is that things don't always turn out the way we plan. And that is because the human mind plans the way, but the Lord directs the steps. That is Proverbs 16, verse 9. And in Psalm 37, we read that if you do what the Lord wants, He will make certain each step you take is sure. The Lord will hold your hand, and if you stumble, you still won't fall. If things don't go according to plan, it won't be the end of it. He can use even that circumstance, even that situation, for His glory, and you won't fall. Let me speed up a bit. So I arrived in Hildesheim. This leads me to number 2, lesson number 2. This is where I was born. This is where I grew up. This is where my parents lived, in this house, number 39 of this particular road. They lived there for 50 years. I walked through that door as a child. First I was carried in as a baby, then I was dragged in as a toddler, then I walked in as a child, and as a teenager I left, and then up and down those stairs because they lived on the 3rd floor. This is where I grew up. This is where I went to school. They changed the door since I went there. I mean, we're talking about 1976 to 1982. What's that? That's almost 40 years ago. It's my old school. I managed to go to the small village where my grandparents used to live. This is where I grew up as a child. I have memories, childhood memories, walking up and down this path in front of the church where my granddad was the organist. It was great. It was wonderful to be in that place, to have those memories and to just look at, to you this is a strange small church in a small village Listring that none of us know where it is except for me, but to me this is my childhood. It was fantastic. Then I drove a couple of hours south to the center of Germany called Darmstadt, and on this road auf der Marienhöhe, this is where I finished my high school. This is the German Adventist high school, and there I finished my high school. We walked down this path every day around that clock. Down there behind this big building is the cafeteria. There are the classrooms. So this is where I went to school. On these steps 30 years ago, in the summer of 1985, exactly 30 years ago, we stood with our high school diplomas and we had finished high school. Yay! And now 30 years later, I returned to the scene of my academic achievement and crimes. After school in Germany, in those days, you had to do national service. At the time, I had to do an alternative service. And so for 2 years, I lived in this room up here at the German Red Cross, and I did home care with them as my alternative service to the armed service. After the armed service, the national service, I went to university. This is the one in Darmstadt where I first went. It's quite interesting because this is a remnant of a different era of German history, which I still found quite intriguing to see after all these years. Well, at least they got rid of the thing that was underneath it, which is good. So once I didn't finish my studies in Germany, and I continued in London, and this is the department of King's College in London, where I studied for my bachelor's degree. I have a bachelor in science in human biology, and this was the door I walked through. Now it's a completely different department because they had restructured it, but they left the door and they left the sign. So this is part of my history, and in King's College they have a chapel that is really beautiful, and it's in the middle of the very busy main building, but it's very quiet, and so it's like an oasis of peace and quietness when you're really busy and your head is starting to spin in the library, and you want to get away from the crowd. You just go to the chapel and chill. I used to catch these buses, and well, this was an old one. This is the one we used to catch. And now they've been replaced. This one no longer, they only have a few left. They're very dirty, but really nice. And they've replaced them with these new ones, which are much cleaner and almost as nice as this one. But here's the thing. And I saw the BBC, and in front of the BBC, there were the names of different places, and I found this. Oh, can't see it. It says Bermuda there, right at the bottom. Oh, interesting, cuts it off. Anyway, Bermuda, which reminds me of another part of my past. But here's the thing. The second lesson I learned looking back on this trip is that as much as I like to go back to those places that I used to live, those places that reminded me of my past, reliving some of those moments even when I graduated from high school and so forth, memory lane is not a residential area. It's a stop with a scenic lookout, but nothing more. Let me say that again. As much as I enjoyed driving down memory lane, figuratively speaking, on this trip, going to places where I grew up as a child, where I went to school, in London, visiting places that were near and dear to me, I realized, looking back, that memory lane is not a residential area. We cannot live in the past. It's only a service station on I-80 with a scenic lookout. That's all it is. You stop, you get out for a moment, you look around, you enjoy the view. But then you have to get back into the car and continue your journey, because memory lane is not a residential area. We cannot live there. I can't live in the past. I can't now start dressing like I did in the 80s and try and wish I was back there in Germany or back there in London. It's impossible. None of us can go back to the past, because memory lane is not a residential area. But here's my thing. In Isaiah, the Lord tells Israelites, forget the former things and don't dwell on the past. And to me, this is a personal verse, because I am a past dweller. I like to sit and chew on my past and on history probably much more and longer than is healthy sometimes. And my wife can vigorously nod in agreement to this statement, because she has the uncanny ability to then pull me out of the cloud of memory lane and bring me back to reality, the here and now. I'm like, thanks. Forget the past. Don't dwell on forget the former things and don't dwell on the past. And in Philippians 3, Paul says that he does not consider himself yet to have taken hold of it, but the one thing he does, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what it is ahead, he says, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. We cannot dwell on the past as if we still live there, because memory lane is not a residential area. That is true in our personal lives, because you can't go back to your past. But let me tell those of us who like to throw other Old Testament verses about, the breach and bridging the breach and all that, you can't go back to the 50s and the 40s and the 30s in Adventism either. Or the 1890s, or the 1900s. We're done with that. We're not there anymore. That's memory lane. If you want to live there, that's fine, but please don't ask me to join you. Because memory lane is not a residential area. If it worked in the 50s and it doesn't work in the 21st century anymore, then that's fine. Let's put it into a museum. Let's look at it from time to time, from a scenic lookout on our road, but we can't go back there and live there. I know some of us, we are so in love with, we think back in the days was the golden age of our church, when we did this and when we did that, and how wonderful it all was. And yet if we were able to go back and live there right now, we would think, good grief, really? We can't go back personally. We can't go back corporately, because memory lane, church, is not a residential area. It's only a scenic lookout on a service station on the road. Yes, there are lessons that we learn. That's why we study history. Those who don't learn from the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them. Spanish philosopher said that. That's why we look back, we see how God has led us, how He has developed us, how He has changed us, and we're grateful for Him and praise Him for it. And we learn from what we learn from the experiences of our personal past, and we learn from the experiences of our corporate church past. But we cannot go back there to live there, because it's not a residential area, it's just a lookout. And I say this because some of our brothers and sisters in the church seem to have mistaken memory lane for a place to live, but it ain't. Which brings me to point number 3. To see all these sites in Germany, and this is the Memorial Church in Germany, in Berlin, which has been left damaged from the war as a memorial to the ravages and the stupidity of warfare. And of course, as Germans, we look at this and we are reminded what caused the war that led to the destruction of this church. Being in Germany and in England, I was surrounded by memorials. There is the Brandenburg Gate, the most famous site in Berlin. Berlin is a city that is drenched in history and has finally come to terms with its more recent past, and in the last 10 or so years there have been memorials to things that when I was a child would have been unthinkable. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe is this. It's a large field of concrete blocks that are sort of lined up, and they create these paths through, and they are all very uneven, and they're supposed to create confusion and a bit unease, and to remember what happened 70 years ago. And when I took this picture, I didn't even realize that right at the end of it, there's the American embassy with the stars and stripes. So you all should be happy. Yay. But the third lesson that I learned has not so much to do with the places that I went to, because there was something in Berlin that really struck me. There were these little brass plaques, like cobblestones in the road. And I wondered, what are these? And they're called Stolpersteine, stumbling blocks. And on these are engraved names, the names of the people that used to live in the houses that these stones are put in front of. So in this particular place, you had the Gluskinos family, all 4 of them here. And you had Irmgard Masse on this side. And what it says on there is that here lived Irmgard Masse. She was born in 1915. She was deported on the 14th of October 1943, and she was murdered in Auschwitz. Here lived Jenny Goldschmidt. She was born, or Nähe Hecht. She was born in 1880. She was deported on the 12th of January 1943, and she was murdered in Auschwitz. The big monument tells you about the big event. The big places or the big buildings show you big places. But it was these small cobblestones that brought it home to me. That more than places and big monuments, it's about people. Here lived Jenny Goldschmidt, whose maiden name was Hecht, who was born in 1880, who was deported on the 12th of January 1943, and who was murdered in Auschwitz. A real person with a name, with the personal history. Because it's not about places. Or I should say, it's not as much about the places as it is about the people. Why do you think that photo of that 2-year-old, 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned off the coast of Turkey was so powerful? Because suddenly all of us realized that these are human beings. These are women and children that try to get away from the chaos and the oppression in Syria. They just try to survive. They just want to have a better life, just like everybody else. Why do you think your forefathers and mothers came to this country? Why don't you think they stayed where they used to live, in Germany, if you're a European ancestor? Why do you think, if you're black, they brought your ancestors here? Because everybody wanted to have a good life. And in the case of African Americans, at their expense. But these are real people. Places are good. People are more important. And so I saw the UNESCO World Heritage Church St. Michael's in my birth town with a wooden ceiling that is, I don't know, 1,000 years old. It's old. Right? Old. I mean 1,000 years. This is in the year 900 or in the year 1000 this thing was started. And I saw this beautiful old building that had been reconstructed from the ground up that was destroyed in the war. This is my hometown. I went to the north to visit some friends of mine, and this is the marketplace in a place called Lüneburg. Beautiful northern German architecture with sunny day, and it was just fun to be in the place. To be in the place in London. This is Jermyn Street. This is where they make fantastic shirts. That's why I like to go there. So I bought this one. If you're not into shirts and stuff, then Jermyn Street doesn't mean a thing to you. But if you're from Europe or London, Jermyn Street, anyway. And there was Drury Lane, where the Muffin Man is supposed to live. Although I neither know him, nor did I find him. These were all places that I saw. I was on the underground, the subway, the London Underground, where sometimes the train stops and there's a gap between the train and the platform, and this famous Mind the Gap sign and the famous Mind the Gap announcement, Mind the Gap. Stand clear of the doors, please. I went to Baker Street, where Sherlock Holmes is supposed to have lived, and so forth. I saw all these places, Piccadilly Circus, with the famous fountain there. Of course, you can't be in London and not take a picture of the Elizabeth Tower or Big Ben. Big Ben really is the on top of the viewing platform, there's a restaurant. And so this is the view that you get from up there. This is central Berlin. There's the Brandenburg Gate. This is all the town center and so forth. But more important than being in the place and seeing the site was to then go upstairs and to have a meal with the family. That's what made it special. Not to have the view, but to have the view with the people. Because while places are important, people are more important. And so seeing all these places was great, but seeing people was greater. These are my parents. And if I hadn't seen anything on this trip, that was worth it, just to see them. To be with my brother and his children, two of which I had never met in my life. There's my brother. There's Fiete. There's Smilla, and there's Emma, the names that lady told me in the train, which freaked me out. And there's my brother's partner, and there's my dad, and then you know these people. Amen. For all of us to be in the same room, to be able to take this picture. These are two friends of mine from way back when, and you don't want to know all the details. I just tell you, it was fun and great to meet these people. I mean, I know this guy from high school. And the old man in the middle, he used to, remember the Red Cross building that I showed you? he had a restaurant right across the street. So when we were doing our national service, we would be patrons of his in his restaurant very, very frequently. Very frequently. He had an excellent wine selection, and this is before he became a pastor, long before he became a pastor, and this is where the illustration will end right there. Suffice to say that he sold the restaurant and he's now in his 80s, but it was great to meet him again. So to see King's College in London and to take a picture of Big Ben was great, but to meet Max again and Money, those two guys on my right there, was even greater. These are faces that don't mean anything to you, but these are people I went to school with. Germany in early August by the sea. It's a beach. I have a picture that I didn't put on. No, I didn't put it on here. But there are people in the water, in their swimming trunks, while I'm sitting there bundled up and, because come on, man, it's in the 90s in New Jersey. And this guy and I, we go back at least 30 plus years. And I just bumped into him on the last day of my stay in Germany. I show you these pictures not because you know these people, but to show you that more important than climbing a tower or taking a picture of a building was to bump into people like these. To meet friends that I hadn't seen sometimes in almost 20 years. To just have a talk with them, to just catch up. You may remember this face. Was it? Yeah, he came here, right? Was it Mount Holly? No, it was here. I mean, this guy. Sorry, this guy you may remember better, but the guy on the left. Costa. I hadn't seen Costa since he left here. So it was great to spend an afternoon and an evening with him. I went to a reunion in my old seminary. And these are teachers and colleagues of mine who went to school with me in this theological seminary in England. This guy in particular was my history teacher. Great man. I was so pleased to see him. And to just say hello. To tell him how much he had influenced my thinking. To let him know as a teacher, all that stuff you tried to teach me, it actually worked. This is another colleague of mine who I hadn't seen in ages and who's now moved on to the division. This guy and I, we shared a tiny room in college together. And it was great to meet his sons, who I hadn't met before. I was there before him and his wife got together, and I knew both of them before, when they were still single, and it's fun to see that they're still together. But yeah, these people and I, we go back a long time. Same with these two gentlemen. Their spiritual journey is interesting. We all grew up in the church, and our paths have slightly digressed since then. But it was great to hang out with them that afternoon and to just speak and to just talk. And maybe one day I'll tell you what we talked about. I show you these pictures because people are more important than places. This is my youngest nephew in London. His name is Noah. Because I hadn't been there for 4.5 years and he is only a couple of months old. How old is Noah? 6 months? 8? 8 months. Well, obviously I didn't know him. I didn't know his brother either. This was the wedding of my nephew. That was the main reason why we went over. The reason was not to see the places. The reason was to reconnect with people. These are my sisters-in-law and nieces. I need to speed up and can't tell you. This is the bride, a Nigerian bride. So that was an interesting wedding. That is a sermon in itself. There's my nephew signing the paperwork. This is them in the evening changing from their European outfit into their Nigerian outfit. It was beautiful. It was great. We were all knackered afterwards. There's video footage that I will not show. Because Nigerian weddings are very musical. And unlike Europeans who stay very silent and quiet when music is playing, Nigerians are anything but. And so we had to contextualize our behavior. Okay, for those of you who didn't get that, we of course had to dance with them. These are the costumes of the family on the bride's side. I'm showing, this is my father-in-law and my brother-in-law from my father-in-law from Jamaica and my brother-in-law lives just outside of London. I hadn't seen these people in a long time. If I had never seen the other sides, if I'd never seen my hometown or my old school or the chapel in King's College, it was for them that we went. My brother and my sisters-in-law and my mother-in-law. Sorry, can't leave her out. There, that's my mother-in-law. If you want to know why Barbara is the way she is, there, it's all her fault. There they are again, Mom and Dad. So when we pray for my father-in-law sometimes, this is he. And this is the older brother of the tiny one. And my grandniece, the daughter of my niece. And then the last weekend that we were there, we had a grand family reunion where a lot of Barbara's sides of the family came together. And not even all of them. And this is just my daughter's generation and younger. So this isn't even their parents, this isn't even the older ones. This is just the young ones. And we had a hard time fitting them into the picture because there's so many of them. But see, here's the thing. Places are good. Structures are important. But they are never as important as people. So when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, when he's asking the church in Corinth, don't you realize that all of you together are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God lives in you? He's not asking about the structure. He's not talking about a building. He is saying that the building, the temple, building was not important. What is important is what the real temple is, and that is the people in the building. I know some of us got a little uncomfortable with my second point already, with the past. Now let me make you even more uncomfortable. This building is never as important as the people that are inside the building. None of our church buildings is as important as the people inside them. Every church building is expendable. Every church building means far less than the people that it was built to serve. Then why do we treat the building more important than the people? The same with our church structure. I went to San Antonio, yes, and I'm let me say this for the record, right? Seventh-day Adventist pastor, yep. That's the organization I work for. They pay my mortgage. Well, not anymore, they pay my rent. But when the structure becomes more important than people, we have a problem. Because Jesus did not come to die for structures. Jesus did not come to die for buildings. God gave his only begotten Son for people. The creator of the universe, the king of the universe, didn't put a price tag on brick and mortar. He put a price tag on flesh and blood. So while the third lesson I learned from my trip, while it was great to see places, it was greater to meet people. While it was great to be in places, it was greater to spend time with my friends and my family, because people are more important. It's a weak amen. You need to realize how important you are in the eyes of God, and how we need to get this in our heads. The priorities have been messed up for centuries. Mainstream church history has brainwashed humanity into thinking that structures and buildings are super important. They are not. When Jesus left the temple and said, "Now your house is left unto you desolate," he walked out of the last holy place on earth. Ever since then, there are no more holy places. We call this a sanctuary, but that's because we say it's a sanctuary, not because God did. If you want to call the president right now, I have him on speed dial, so don't worry. He'll agree with me. Because people are more important than structures. People. And that's what frightened me at San Antonio, where I saw structures, at the GC session, structures and their defenses became more important than people. The Lord didn't die for the Seventh-day Adventist church organization. He didn't die for all these small ministries that have sprung up like mushrooms around us. Those are all structures. What matters are people. Because God will destroy anyone who destroys this temple. What temple? The building? No, the building collapsed in 70 AD. No, the temple that he's talking about in the previous verse. You, all of you together, are the temple. Peter says that we are holy, we are like living stones building a building. We, as people, are the temple. In 1 Corinthians 6, he's talking about you individually. Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. That's why you need to take care of it and exercise, right, Yehuru? That's why we do what we do. But in chapter 3, he's not talking about the individual, he's talking about the group. We, all of us, constitute the temple. And if I or you mess with the temple, then God is going to come down on us like a ton of bricks. God will destroy anyone who destroys that temple. Because God's temple is holy, and you, all of you, plural, all of us, are that temple. That's the strong language God is using to bring across to us that thing, that structures are helpful. Yes, having a building is great, right? So that we don't have to sit out under the tree in the humidity and in the heat, that we can be in here in this nice air-conditioned room. That's all great. But greater than the structures, greater than the buildings, are the people. 3 lessons from my vacation. Things don't always turn out the way we do. And that teaches us patience, contentment. It helps us to exercise. And sometimes there is a silver lining around it. The second lesson I learned is that as much as I love to go back down memory lane and enjoy the ride, it's not a residential area. I can't live there anymore because I don't. It's just a stopover. It's just a scenic lookout. A place to stop briefly and enjoy the view. And yes, enjoy the view and be encouraged by it, but then I have to move on because I live in the present. And thirdly, I learned that while visiting all these places was fantastic, and I treasure the memory of this trip, greater than the places are the people that we met. Greater than the places were the interactions with our family and with our friends. Because places and structures are good, but people are infinitely more valuable and more important. So may God bless us as we ponder and hopefully learn a thing or two from the vacation lessons. God bless you.